Segment 1, Oil, Empire, and the Coup, Iran from 1901 to 1953. In the beginning, it was just a signature, a single stroke of ink on a contract that would ripple through history. The year was 1901. A British millionaire named William Knox D'Arcy secured exclusive rights from Persia's Qajar monarchy to explore for oil, for the price of £20,000 in cash, £20,000 in shares, and 16% of future profits. It was a deal struck between a desperate monarchy and a speculative investor. D'Arcy was gambling on oil in a land not yet known for it. The Qajars were trading long-term sovereignty for short-term relief. This wasn't just a business contract. It was an opening move in a century-long struggle for control of Iran's most precious resource. The concession covered over 3/4 of Iran's landmass. At the time, this vast country was weak and fractured. The Qajar dynasty, ruling since the late 1700s, was indebted to European powers, lacking internal cohesion and losing control over its own provinces. British and Russian forces maintained heavy economic and political influence, and the Iranian state was often sidelined in decisions that shaped its destiny. For 7 years, D'Arcy's venture looked like a failure. Oil exploration in the harsh terrain of southwest Iran yielded nothing. Financially drained, D'Arcy almost sold his rights to the French. But just before the deal closed, in 1908, fortune struck. His drilling team struck oil at Masjid Soleimani. It was a gusher, the first significant oil discovery in the Middle East. The implications were seismic. Within months, the British government intervened, pressuring D'Arcy to consolidate his holdings into a new entity, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, or APOC. In 1914, on the eve of the First World War, the British government purchased a majority stake in APOC to secure fuel for its naval fleet, shifting the Royal Navy from coal to oil. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, wrote, "Mastery itself was the prize of the venture." Iran's oil became a strategic asset for British global dominance. But to Iranians, this transformation yielded little. While APOC expanded production and built massive infrastructure, including the refinery at Abadan, Iran's profits remained capped at 16%, and that too subject to creative accounting by APOC. Workers in Iranian oil towns lived in dire conditions, with British staff enjoying segregated housing, exclusive clubs, and higher pay. Strikes became increasingly common. This inequality bred resentment. By the 1920s, a young military officer named Reza Khan was rising through the ranks of the Persian Cossack Brigade. In 1921, with tacit British backing, he staged a coup against the Qajar government. Though debate continues about Britain's exact role, it's clear they saw in Reza Khan a man who could stabilize Iran, suppress Bolshevik influence, and protect British oil. Within 4 years, Reza Khan became Reza Shah Pahlavi, founding a new dynasty. He pursued aggressive modernization, railroads, a national army, secular education, and centralization of power. He curtailed the influence of clerics and tribal leaders, building a state in the image of European secular nationalism. But this progress came at a cost. Dissent was crushed, political opponents exiled or executed, journalists silenced. Iran modernized, but it did not democratize. One of Reza Shah's key moves was renegotiating the D'Arcy concession. In 1933, under rising domestic pressure, he signed a new deal with APOC. It seemed like a gain. Royalties were fixed, labor conditions improved, and the concession area was reduced. But the agreement extended APOC's control until 1993. Many Iranians saw it as a betrayal, disguised as reform. A generation would grow up remembering that contract. Then came World War II. Though Iran declared neutrality, its geographic location made it a critical transit route for Allied supplies to the Soviet Union. and Reza Shah's perceived sympathies for Germany alarmed both Britain and the USSR. In 1941, they jointly invaded Iran, deposed Reza Shah, and installed his 21-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Though not colonized in name, Iran was occupied until 1946. The trauma of this foreign incursion deepened Iran's suspicion of global powers and intensified calls for national sovereignty. In the post-war years, Iranian nationalism reached a boiling point. Political parties, students, clerics, and intellectuals rallied around a single issue: reclaiming control of oil. Enter Mohammad Mossadegh, a seasoned politician, deeply principled, and a fierce advocate for Iranian democracy. Educated in Switzerland, Mossadegh became the leader of the National Front, a coalition pushing for the nationalization of the oil industry and greater parliamentary control. In 1951, Mossadegh was appointed prime minister. Within weeks, he passed legislation nationalizing the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, formerly APOC. This was revolutionary. A former colony was reclaiming its resources, but to Britain, it was economic war. The British government launched an oil embargo, froze Iranian assets, and filed lawsuits in international courts. Global oil companies, sympathetic to Britain, boycotted Iranian crude. The Abadan refinery shut down. Iran's economy spiraled. Yet domestically, Mossadegh remained popular. He represented a democratic aspiration, not only for economic justice, but for constitutional governance. He curtailed royal power, expelled British diplomats, and appealed directly to the Iranian people. In 1952, Time magazine named him Man of the Year. But his enemies were growing. The Shah, military elites, conservative clerics, and landowners saw him as a threat. Western intelligence agencies feared Iran might drift toward the Soviet Union. Though Mossadegh was not a communist, his alliance with Iran's Tudeh leftist party unnerved the West. Then came Operation Ajax. In August 1953, the CIA and MI6 launched a covert operation to remove Mossadegh. Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of former U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, led the CIA team on the ground. They funneled cash to royalist generals, orchestrated street protests, and spread anti-Mossadegh propaganda. The first coup attempt failed. The Shah fled Iran. But the second attempt succeeded. On August 19th, pro-Shah military units overthrew Mossadegh. He was arrested and sentenced to house arrest for life. The Shah returned, backed by the United States. Iranian democracy had been overthrown. Competing narratives. Western view. The coup prevented Iran from falling into Soviet hands. Mossadegh was authoritarian and destabilizing. The Shah brought modernization and stability. Iranian view. The coup was colonial interference to protect oil profits. Mossadegh was a symbol of democracy and sovereignty. The Shah was a puppet ruler imposed by the West. Modern consensus. Declassified CIA documents confirm U.S. orchestration. Mossadegh had broad popular support and was not a communist. The coup poisoned U.S.-Iran relations and remains a central grievance. Legacy. This half-century set the tone for everything that followed. Oil defined Iran's economic and political fate. Foreign intervention shaped Iranian identity and suspicion. The 1953 coup ended a budding democratic movement, laying the groundwork for radical revolution. To many Iranians, this wasn't history. It was the betrayal that shaped their world. And now, with the Shah firmly back in power, we enter a new phase, the era of petro-wealth, Cold War allegiance, and a monarchy desperate to modernize while holding back the tides of political dissent. That is where Segment 2 begins. Segment 2, the Shah, Oil, and Autocracy, Iran from 1953 to 1979. August 1953. The streets of Tehran were tense with anticipation. Tanks rolled through the capital. The Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, had been deposed. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had fled just days earlier, returned triumphantly to reclaim his throne. It marked not just a political reversal, but a seismic transformation in Iran's trajectory. What unfolded over the next 26 years would reshape Iran's institutions, economy, society, and its place in the world. It was a period defined by authoritarian consolidation, oil-driven modernization, Western alignment, and rising domestic discontent. Part 1. The Return of the King. In the wake of Operation Ajax, the CIA and MI6-backed coup, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi returned to Iran not merely as a monarch, but as a strategic asset of the West. American and British intelligence operatives had orchestrated the overthrow of Mossadegh, whose bold move to nationalize Iran's oil industry had triggered a confrontation with British Petroleum and the broader Anglo-American bloc. Though the Shah had previously hesitated in exercising his powers, he now moved decisively. His return was conditional. Western support came with strings attached. Within a year, Iran signed the 1954 Consortium Agreement, which parceled out Iranian oil production rights among a group of Western companies. While Iran nominally received 50% of the profits, real operational control remained abroad. The oil was Iranian. The infrastructure, logistics, and pricing mechanisms were not. With the oil industry back under foreign stewardship, the Shah positioned himself as the champion of progress. He wore full military regalia, made media appearances extolling national strength, and adopted the image of a modernizing sovereign committed to elevating Iran's global standing. He called this vision the Great Civilization. But modernization, as the coming years would show, came at a steep cost. Part 2. The Architecture of Repression. Modernization required order, and order, the Shah believed, required absolute control. In 1957, with guidance from the CIA and Israel's Mossad, the Shah established SAVAK, the Organization of Intelligence and National Security. SAVAK was not merely a spy agency. It was an omnipresent force embedded in the lives of Iranians. Universities were infiltrated. Newspapers were censored. Homes were monitored. Private letters were opened and copied. Political opponents were disappeared, often tortured in clandestine prisons. The Tudeh Party, which had once been a powerful leftist force in Iranian politics, was dismantled. Its members were hunted down. The National Front, weakened after Mossadegh's fall, was rendered politically impotent. Intellectuals and artists, like Jalal Ali Ahmad and Simin Behbahani, lived under constant threat. The Shah justified this apparatus as necessary for stability and development. Yet beneath the rhetoric of progress was a system of fear. Part 3. The White Revolution, Reform or Rupture. In 1963, the Shah unveiled the White Revolution, a top-down reform initiative meant to preempt both communist and Islamist opposition. Its key tenets included land redistribution to break up large estates, profit-sharing schemes for industrial workers, literacy and health corps dispatched to rural areas, nationalization of forests and waterways, the enfranchisement of women, including the right to vote. On paper, it appeared transformative. In practice, its effects were mixed. Land reform fragmented estates, but often left peasants without viable plots or access to credit. Many rural workers migrated to urban centers in search of employment, only to find overcrowded neighborhoods and rising costs. The swelling urban poor became a new social class, disillusioned, restless, and politically invisible. The enfranchisement of women, while celebrated by many in the cities, provoked fierce opposition from the clergy. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, then an influential cleric in Qom, emerged as a vocal critic. In June 1963, He denounced the Shah and his alliance with the U.S. in a fiery sermon. For this, he was arrested. The arrest triggered mass protests in Tehran and Qom. Tanks rolled through streets. Demonstrators were killed. Though crushed militarily, the uprising marked the first major challenge to the Shah's authority since the coup. Khomeini was exiled, first to Turkey, then to Iraq, but his sermons, recorded and smuggled back into Iran on cassette tapes, gained traction among a growing opposition network. Part 4. The Oil Windfall and Economic Euphoria. The 1970s began with a global crisis that proved beneficial for Iran. The 1973 Arab-Israeli War prompted OPEC to impose an oil embargo on Western countries. Oil prices quadrupled. Iran, as a founding member of OPEC, found itself awash in petrodollars. Between 1973 and 1977, government revenues surged. The Shah embarked on an aggressive modernization campaign. Iran became the largest arms buyer from the United States outside of NATO. Civilian nuclear cooperation with the West was initiated. Infrastructure megaprojects, highways, steel plants, power stations, were built almost overnight. Tehran was rapidly transformed, with skyscrapers, cultural centers, and luxury hotels. International observers hailed Iran as a regional superpower in the making. Yet beneath the surface, fundamental problems festered. Inflation spiraled. Urban migration accelerated. Economic growth was uneven. The middle class felt squeezed, and the poor were largely left behind. Corruption and cronyism flourished. The Shah's court became synonymous with extravagance, Western consultants, lavish parties, and opulent displays, such as the 1971 Persepolis celebration commemorating 2,500 years of monarchy. This ostentatious spectacle, held amid impoverished villages and economic uncertainty, symbolized for many the disconnect between the monarchy and the nation. Part 5. Culture Wars and Political Islam. Modernization brought Western culture flooding into Iran's cities. Western movies played in cinemas. American fashion graced boutiques. Nightclubs opened in northern Tehran. The state discouraged the wearing of the hijab and promoted secular values. For many Iranians, especially in the urban middle and upper classes, this was exciting and liberating. But for others, conservative families, rural communities, the clergy, it felt like cultural erasure. Khomeini, writing from exile, began articulating a radical alternative, Velayat-e-Faqih, or the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. He proposed that in the absence of the infallible imam, a qualified cleric should lead the Muslim community. This was not merely a critique of the Shah. It was a blueprint for replacing the secular state with a theocratic one. His ideas were disseminated through underground networks, resonating with those alienated by the regime's westernization and political repression. Part 6. The empire falters. By the mid to late 1970s, Iran was simmering. Inflation and unemployment surged. Labor unrest grew. Student demonstrations became more frequent. Intellectuals and artists spoke out more boldly. In 1975, the Shah disbanded all political parties and established the single-party Rostakiz system. Participation was mandatory. Boycotts were criminalized. Even loyalists grew uneasy. Under pressure from President Jimmy Carter's human rights agenda, the Shah released some political prisoners in 1977 and slightly eased censorship. But rather than diffusing tensions, this opening emboldened critics. In January 1978, a government newspaper published an article defaming Khomeini. Protests erupted in Qom. Security forces opened fire. The 40-day mourning tradition led to sequential protests across cities: Tabriz, Yazd, Tehran. The cycle escalated. By late 1978, oil workers struck, crippling the economy. The bazaars shut in protest. Nationwide demonstrations paralyzed governance. Despite martial law, the military began to splinter. On January 16, 1979, the Shah left Iran, ostensibly for medical treatment. 2 weeks later, Khomeini returned to a hero's welcome. The monarchy collapsed almost immediately. Competing narratives. Western view. From the Western perspective, the Shah was a beacon of modernity in a volatile region. He was seen as a bulwark against communism and an ally in securing oil supplies. Iran's rapid industrialization, educational reforms, and women's rights initiatives were hailed as evidence of successful modernization. To many Western governments and media outlets, the revolution was an unexpected upheaval, a radical rejection of progress, spurred by irrational religious fervor and potentially manipulated by Soviet influence. Iranian nationalist view. Many Iranian nationalists viewed the Shah not as a sovereign but as a foreign puppet, installed and sustained by American and British interests. They saw the 1953 coup as a betrayal of Iran's democratic aspirations and the nationalization of oil as a stolen dream. Economic modernization, while real, was perceived as uneven and corrupt. The wealth was concentrated among elites and foreign investors. The Shah's repression and disregard for cultural and religious identity alienated much of the population. For these Iranians, the revolution was not radical. It was righteous. Clerical Islamic view. To the clerical establishment and their followers, the Shah's secularization policies represented an existential threat. They believed that Islam was not just a private faith, but the foundation of governance and society. Western cultural imports, from dress to values, were seen as spiritual contamination. Khomeini's vision of velayat-e-faqih offered not just political resistance, but theological legitimacy. His return was framed as a divine triumph. The revolution, in this view, was less about politics and more about restoring divine order. Modern consensus. Today, most scholars agree that the Iranian Revolution was driven by a convergence of factors: political repression, economic inequality, cultural dislocation, and religious mobilization. Khomeini's ascendance was not preordained, but was the result of strategic positioning, effective propaganda, and the collapse of alternative reformist forces. Western support for the Shah, while stabilizing in the short term, ultimately undermined possibilities for democratic evolution and empowered more radical alternatives. Legacy. This was not a mere leadership change. It marked the collapse of a 2,500-year monarchy and the birth of a theocratic republic. It was a rupture that would redefine not just Iran, but the geopolitics of the Middle East. And in the power vacuum left by the Shah, a new force had emerged to shape the coming era: the Islamic Republic under Ayatollah Khomeini. Segment 3 will explore the immediate aftermath, the revolution's consolidation, the American hostage crisis, and the brutal 8-year war with Iraq that followed. Segment 3: Revolution, Hostages, and War. Iran from 1979 to 1988. February 1st, 1979. A chartered Air France jet lands at Mehrabad International Airport in Tehran. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, having spent 15 years in exile, steps onto the tarmac and into the hearts of over 1 million ecstatic supporters. The Shah's reign has ended. The Islamic Republic has begun, not with calm, but with rupture, defiance, and the promise of transformation. The Pahlavi dynasty was over, but who, inside the chaos, would lead the new Iran? Banners waved across Tehran, Tabriz, and Shiraz, each group proclaiming different hopes: secular democracy, Marxist revolution, Islamist state, revived monarchy. The air buzzed with possibility and fragility. Khomeini moved swiftly. Appointing Mehdi Bazargan as provisional prime minister offered a veneer of inclusivity. But power was shifting in mosques, bazaars, and newly formed revolutionary organs. By May 1979, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, stood as a force loyal only to the revolution. not to any civilian authority. In hidden courtrooms, former advisors and generals faced summary justice. SAVAK officers were publicly executed by hanging, their bodies left in squares as warnings. University professors were forced to swear loyalty or disappear. Prisons swollen. A young seminary student in Qom listens to a cleric urging support for the revolution. His voice quivers. If Islam is to guide Iran, every mosque must become a command center. Weeks later, he helps storm a newspaper office. He believes he's defending the revolution, though many intellectuals call it theocracy in motion. The new constitution enshrined Velayat-e-Faqih, the supreme leader's rule over all branches of government, media, military, and judiciary. It was ratified through a referendum offering only one option: yes to an Islamic Republic. Democracy under clerical oversight, the architects claimed. Everyday life transformed almost overnight. Women were told to wear hijab in public. Men couldn't shave their beards if they worked in government. Alcohol went underground as smugglers turned hajis, pilgrims, into secret carriers. Mixed-gender universities became mixed-gender battlegrounds. Bookstores closed for ideological review. For some, it felt like liberation from Western decadence. For others, like a new invisible iron curtain settling over society. Just 9 months later, on November 4th, 1979, students referred to as Imam's disciples stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. They accused its diplomats of plotting against revolution, demanded the Shah's return to face justice, and seized 66 hostages. Within hours, Khomeini declared, "This is the second revolution." The embassy was transformed into a theater of defiance. Hostages were blindfolded, paraded before world media, and used to amplify anti-imperialist fervor. Death to America chants echoed through Tehran. A hostage, speaking off camera, recalls, "They held a press conference with children cheering. One girl pressed a fresh orange into my bloodied hand, saying, 'Now you'll help us taste freedom.'" The moment encapsulates how ideological zeal and human empathy intertwined. In Washington, President Carter froze Iranian assets and imposed sanctions. A secret rescue attempt, Operation Eagle Claw, ended in disaster when a transport helicopter crashed in the desert, killing 8 American soldiers and shattering U.S. pride. 444 days later, on January 20th, 1981, the hostages were released, the exact day Ronald Reagan was sworn in. The timing was no accident. Iran had made a statement. It would not negotiate with America under Carter's presidency. Domestically, the crisis was a turning point. Bazargan resigned, calling it a club used by radicals. Moderates were eclipsed as hardliners demanded absolute loyalty. Iran abandoned any hope of reconciliation. Barely had the hostages left when Saddam Hussein's tanks rolled across Iran's western border in September 1980. He believed Iran was weak, divided, and ripe for invasion. Motivated by nationalist ambition and oil geopolitics, Iraq invaded Khuzestan, home to Iran's vital oil fields and Arab minority. Initially, Iraq made gains, but Iran responded with fervor. Under Khomeini, the war was declared a holy defense. State media broadcast slogans like, "We defend our land or die as martyrs." Even children as young as 12 joined the Basij militia. A Basij volunteer, aged 15, carrying prayer beads and a dusty rifle, whispers to himself before a dawn attack, "If I die for Islam, I'll be with them in paradise." The war, he believes, is not just territorial, it's spiritual. By 1982, Iran had pushed back Iraqi forces and launched offensives over the frontier. But it was no swift liberation. Chemical gas killed soldiers and civilians alike. Cities like Avaz and Dezful were reduced to rubble. The tanker war in the Persian Gulf drew international naval attention. Global powers watched warily. The U.S. provided satellite intelligence to Iraq, while France sold Mirage jets. The USSR and Gulf states pumped cash and weapons into Baghdad. Iran was under siege, militarily, economically, diplomatically. An Iranian oil worker working on a pipeline near Abadan says, "The field is our future, but they bombed it. We built it again in trenches and flames because we had no choice." The war quickly became about survival as much as revolution. By 1988, over 1 million Iranians were dead or wounded. Borderlands were scarred, cities shattered. Yet Khomeini still refused to accept peace, calling victory a divine necessity. When he finally agreed to UN Resolution 598 in July 1988, he referred to it as drinking poison. There were no winners, only trauma and endurance. While war raged, the Islamic Republic reshaped every aspect of society. Government institutions, presidency, parliament, judiciary, existed under the authority of the supreme leader. The IRGC grew in power, claiming authority over economic sectors, politics, and media. Censorship became a norm. Newspapers shut overnight, writers imprisoned, filmmakers surveilled. The final months of the 1980s saw secret executions of thousands of political prisoners, especially among MEK and leftist supporters. Yet public support remained varied. In poorer provinces, the state's war relief efforts and Islamic charities brought vital services. Welfare distribution among low-income families created loyalty. In urban areas, intellectuals and students whispered dissent behind closed doors, or found refuge in underground art, music, and literature. Women navigated daily challenges, wearing the veil, resisting moral policing, reclaiming public space. Some plotted simple acts of defiance, reciting poetry, hosting clandestine gatherings, singing banned songs. The veil, once a symbol of religious resurgence, became for some a tool of control. Others saw it as a reclaiming of dignity. From the Western perspective, Iran in the 1980s was cast as a warning about revolution turned radical. The hostage crisis, where blindfolded Americans were paraded before the world, shaped public consciousness. Executions, media censorship, and the regime's rhetoric all contributed to an image of an ideologically militant state. The prolongation of the Iran-Iraq War reinforced the perception that the Islamic Republic prioritized ideology over human cost. Western governments, while critical, also participated indirectly, some backing Iraq materially while publicly denouncing both sides. From within the Islamic Republic, the 1980s were framed as years of righteous struggle. The revolution cast off foreign domination and resurrected dignity rooted in Islamic values. Hostages weren't a breach of diplomacy, but a symbolic justice. War wasn't an unwanted calamity, but a divine test. Martyrdom became a cultural currency. Films, school books, and sermons all carried the message: sacrifice today secures salvation tomorrow. Iran, under siege, stood alone, proof of its ideological purity and resilience. Iranian nationalists had a more conflicted view. Many had hoped the Shah's removal would birth a republic grounded in sovereignty and secularism. What followed instead was clerical dominance and ideological rigidity. For these voices, Khomeini's refusal to end the war in 1982 was not strategy, but stubbornness. The state's increasing repression betrayed the revolution's original pluralism. Still, the shared memory of resisting foreign aggression lent the decade a bittersweet legitimacy. Exiled monarchists viewed the decade as catastrophic. The Shah, though autocratic, was seen by his supporters as a modernizer, replaced by what they regarded as a reactionary theocracy. They mourned the collapse of institutions, the brain drain of Iran's educated class, and the loss of international prestige. Their narrative was steeped in nostalgia and alarm, casting the Islamic Republic as an aberration. The MEK and Marxist left, brutally suppressed during this decade, saw the revolution as hijacked. They had marched alongside Islamists in 1979, only to be hunted by them by 1981. From Paris, Berlin, and underground bunkers, their literature spoke of betrayal, tyranny, and the obliteration of dissent. The war, they argued, served the regime, not the nation. Quietist clerics, those who believed religion should guide society but not govern it, watched with growing unease. They feared that Islam, entangled with politics, would be corrupted by power. Some withdrew from public life. Others issued cautious statements urging restraint. Their voices, though rarely amplified, represented a theological rift with enduring implications. Modern analysts see the 1980s as Iran's crucible, a young state forged in revolution, tempered by war, and sealed by isolation. The regime consolidated, but at enormous cost. Trauma became identity. Resilience was both necessity and myth. Iran exited the decade more ideologically rigid, but also more domestically cohesive. The scars, however, remained deep. By 1988, Iran was unrecognizable from the monarchy it had once been. Wounds, both emotional and physical, ran deep. Theocratic institutions had taken root. The IRGC had become too powerful to ignore. The war's rhetoric continued in daily worship and politics. Khomeini remained supreme leader until his death in 1989. His passing would usher in a new era, one where a less charismatic Ali Khamenei would steer a wounded country through reconstruction, reform, and renewed global ambitions. Segment 4 will explore Iran after Khomeini's death. The rise of Khamenei, the reformist wave, renewed energy diplomacy, and Iran's re-emergence on the world stage. Segment 4, Reconstruction and Reform, Iran from 1989 to 1999. June 1989. Tehran becomes a city of mourning. Black banners stretch across avenues, crowds weep in unison, and the air buzzes with religious chants. Over 10 million people gather to mourn the passing of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. For a moment, it seems the revolution itself is being buried. But beneath the grief lies urgency. The Islamic Republic must now prove its resilience, not through charisma, but through continuity. The assembly of experts convenes quickly. Their decision shocks many. They appoint Ali Khamenei, then a mid-ranking cleric with limited theological credentials, as supreme leader. He lacks the revered status of Khomeini, but he is ideologically loyal and politically savvy. His appointment marks a turning point. The role of supreme leader begins to shift from divine spiritual authority to calculated political power. A republic once fueled by messianic zeal now inches toward bureaucratic consolidation. In tandem, another figure rises, Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani. A wartime commander turned president, Rafsanjani inherits a nation battered by an 8-year war. Cities lie in ruin, the economy is hemorrhaging, and a new generation is coming of age with only memories of sirens and funerals. Rafsanjani's promise is simple: pragmatism over ideology, rebuilding over resistance. Factories reopen, infrastructure projects explode, dams, power plants, roads, and housing units begin to reshape the country's landscape. The technocrats return. Educated Iranians who had once fled are invited back to manage this new phase of economic revival. But alongside these hopeful developments, shadow economies bloom. The Revolutionary Guards, increasingly sidelined from formal policy-making, begin infiltrating commerce. Bonyads, charitable trusts with opaque accounting, consolidate vast financial empires. The result is uneven prosperity. In Tehran's affluent north, cafes sell espresso and satellite dishes pick up foreign news. In Kermanshah, power cuts are routine and schools operate with broken windows. This growing disparity creates tension. A young student at Sharif University remarks, "They promised development. We got privilege." Despite his economic pragmatism, Rafsanjani enforces strict social controls. Censorship remains rigid. Political dissent is criminalized. In 1991, a group of 134 writers publishes a letter demanding freedom of expression. The regime responds with arrests and surveillance. Reform, it seems, can pave roads, but not minds. Internationally, Iran's reputation sours further. Khomeini's 1989 fatwa against Salman Rushdie sends shockwaves across Europe. Western capitals recall ambassadors. Then, in 1992, the Mykonos restaurant assassinations in Berlin implicate top Iranian officials in orchestrating extrajudicial killings abroad. A German court rules that Iran's government ordered the murders of Kurdish opposition leaders. The verdict reverberates. European nations halt diplomatic overtures. Sanctions tighten. Iran's isolation deepens. Yet the story inside Iran is more complex. A generational shift is brewing. The children of the revolution, those born in the early 1980s, begin to question its outcomes. More literate, more urban, and increasingly connected to the outside world, they are frustrated by the gap between state rhetoric and lived reality. In Esfahan, teenagers gather secretly to listen to banned music, watching dubbed American sitcoms through jerry-rigged satellite receivers. A girl named Zara writes in her diary, "They fear our ideas more than our actions." The mid-90s see a rising tension between an emergent civil society and the entrenched clerical elite. Universities become incubators for new political thought. Students study translated works of Rousseau, Kant, and John Stuart Mill, often under the radar. Underground literary circles flourish. Feminist voices begin to challenge theocratic narratives on gender. Then, in 1997, comes an unexpected rupture. Mohammad Khatami, a former minister of culture with a mild demeanor and reformist leanings, launches a presidential campaign centered on civil society, dialogue, and the rule of law. He speaks the language of inclusion. Youth, women, and intellectuals rally behind him. Despite opposition from hardliners, he wins in a landslide, over 70% of the vote. 20 million Iranians demand a new direction. The Khatami presidency ignites what some call a Tehran Spring. Newspapers proliferate. Seminars on democracy are held openly. Women's rights groups gain prominence. Even some elements of the clergy begin debating the compatibility of Islam and liberalism. Iranian cinema flourishes, with filmmakers like Abbas Kiarostami mastering allegory to bypass censors. One of his films depicts a boy searching for his lost notebook. Critics praise it as a meditation on innocence, but audiences read between the lines. It is about loss, identity, and resistance. For a brief moment, optimism returns. In Shiraz, young couples walk hand in hand. In Qum, even seminaries discuss political reform. Bloggers emerge as a new class of dissident, typing carefully worded critiques from cyber cafes under pseudonyms. Civil society, long suppressed, begins to breathe. But not everyone is cheering. The judiciary, still under conservative control, begins a systematic campaign to silence reformist voices. Independent newspapers are shut down. Student organizations are infiltrated. The IRGC warns that the cultural opening threatens the revolution's moral fabric. Clerical vigilantes like Ansari Hezbollah attack bookshops and disrupt lectures. And then, the killings begin. In late 1998, a string of assassinations, later known as the chain murders, targets prominent dissidents, intellectuals, and writers. The Ministry of Intelligence, under pressure, admits to the crimes, but claims they were the actions of rogue agents. The public is unconvinced. Khatami demands accountability, but finds himself blocked by the deep state. The breaking point comes in July 1999. The banning of a reformist newspaper ignites student protests at Tehran University. What begins as a sit-in turns violent. Plainclothes officers and Basij paramilitary forces raid dormitories at night. Students are dragged from their beds, beaten, arrested, some disappear. At least 5 are killed. The public watches in horror. For many, the illusion of peaceful reform shatters. Khatami denounces the violence but is increasingly viewed as powerless. The unelected centers of power, the Supreme Leader, the Guardian Council, the IRGC, and the judiciary, reassert control. Hope gives way to resignation. Yet the questions linger. Can the system reform itself, or is change only possible through rupture? Still, the social fabric is altered. University enrollment among women surpasses men. Bookstores prominently display translated Western philosophy. A cleric in Qom confesses anonymously to a journalist. The youth ask questions we no longer have answers for. Western perspective. The West views this decade as a tale of 2 Irans, one that remains hostile, supporting Hezbollah, suppressing dissent, and defying international norms, and another that signals reform. Khatami's election intrigues European capitals. Some, like Britain and France, cautiously explore dialogue. The United States remains skeptical. The contradiction between rhetoric and reality prevents normalization. Yet for Western analysts, this is Iran's most promising window in years. Islamic Republic perspective. From within the regime, this decade is about preserving power under the guise of flexibility. Rafsanjani's economic liberalization and Khatami's cultural reforms are tolerated, but only to a point. The Supreme Leader ensures that red lines are never crossed. Reform is allowed to relieve pressure, not to transform structure. In official narratives, the Republic is maturing, but beneath the surface, it is calcifying. Nationalist perspective. For secular nationalists, the 1990s are bittersweet. Khatami's rise proves that the Iranian public hungers for change, but his impotence reveals the system's resistance to evolution. The lesson: elections can inspire, but not restructure. Still, nationalists acknowledge that civil society gains ground and that ideas once unspeakable now echo in classrooms, cafes, and homes. Exiled monarchist and opposition view. From abroad, particularly in the diaspora hubs of Los Angeles, Paris, and London, reform is dismissed as illusion. Khatami is viewed as a controlled safety valve, a puppet meant to distract. Satellite broadcasters mock the reform movement as naive. Yet even critics concede that Iran's youth are different. They are less dogmatic, more assertive, and increasingly disenchanted with both monarchy and theocracy. Modern analyst perspective. Today's scholars see this era as Iran's inward decade. Post-war trauma met rising civil consciousness. Reform faltered not because of public apathy, but because power lay outside the reach of elected officials. Still, the intellectual and cultural gains of this period laid foundations for future mobilizations. The press learned to question. Citizens learned to organize. The regime learned it could no longer control every narrative. By 1999, the contradictions are clear. Iran has rebuilt roads, but not trust. It has opened markets, but not minds. It has permitted dialogue, but punished dissent. And yet, the people, especially its youth, have changed. They are no longer silent. They are no longer afraid to ask. The next decade will test how far those voices can carry, and how hard the system will push back. Segment 5 will explore the years 2000 to 2009. When hope confronts repression, nuclear ambition rises, and the promise of reform meets its hardest test. Segment 5. From Reform to Repression, Iran's Crossroads, 2000 to 2013. The year is 2000. Iran stands at a political inflection point. Mohammad Khatami, re-elected with strong support after his 1997 landslide, is backed by a sweeping reformist victory in the 6th module's elections. Civil society responds with an outpouring of energy. Students, journalists, and women's groups rally behind proposals for press freedom, judicial independence, and electoral transparency. Cafes, bookshops, and campuses pulse with debate. But these aspirations face immediate institutional resistance. The Guardian Council disqualifies bills aimed at civil liberties and electoral reform, asserting its constitutional oversight. The judiciary shutters over 100 reformist newspapers between 2000 and 2001. Security agencies summon and intimidate activists. The intelligence ministry, operating parallel to the elected government, monitors dissent with increasing sophistication, and unelected bodies like the Guardian Council, Supreme Leader's Office, and judiciary constrain Khatami's executive power. In 2003, the case of Zahra Kazemi, a journalist who died under interrogation, sparks outrage. Students protest across campuses, yet the state doubles down. Activists are arrested. Judiciary officials promise accountability, but deliver little. The reform movement, once buoyed by hope, begins to fragment. Meanwhile, a seismic event reshapes Iran's regional posture: the U.S. invasion of Iraq. The 2003 toppling of Saddam Hussein removes a major adversary. Iran seizes the opportunity to expand influence through Shia political factions in Baghdad. Conservative voices inside Iran use this to argue that foreign plots remain an existential threat. The state's intelligence and military wings grow more powerful, citing national security. Domestically, the economic promises of the reformists begin to fray. Inflation rises. Unemployment remains high, especially among the youth. Disillusionment spreads. Voter turnout drops in local and parliamentary elections. In 2004, mass disqualifications of reformist candidates again tilt power toward conservatives in the modules. Khatami, now in his second term, finds himself increasingly sidelined. Frustrated reformists withdraw. Others begin organizing outside of formal political structures. Then, in 2005, an unlikely candidate emerges: Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, a former IRGC officer and mayor of Tehran. He runs a populist campaign centered on anti-corruption, redistributive justice, and revolutionary values. In televised debates, he contrasts his simple lifestyle with the perceived elitism of rivals like Rafsanjani. He advances to the runoff and secures a surprising victory. Ahmadinejad's presidency signals a pivot. He places IRGC affiliates in key ministries and accelerates their entry into infrastructure, oil, and telecommunications contracts. The military security establishment, once behind the scenes, becomes a central governing force. The Bonyads and IRGC-run firms like Khatam al-Anbiya begin controlling large swaths of the economy. Ahmadinejad attempts to rebrand the state's economic identity as revolutionary and self-sufficient. He launches major housing initiatives like the Mayor program, offering subsidized units to low-income families. He promises rural development through direct cash payments and microloans, aiming to win over Iran's peripheries. However, these programs are poorly managed and underfunded, leading to inflation and rising public debt. In foreign policy, Ahmadinejad adopts a confrontational tone. His 2005 speech questioning the Holocaust and calling for Israel's removal draws global condemnation. Israel, alarmed by Iran's rhetoric and nuclear activity, intensifies intelligence operations and lobbies Western allies for a stronger response. Iran resumes uranium enrichment, citing sovereign rights. Western diplomacy falters. In 2006, the UN Security Council imposes sanctions. Iran's financial sector begins to suffer. That same year, Iran provides robust support to Hezbollah during the 2006 Israel-Lebanon war. Iranian funding, arms, and training enhance Hezbollah's military capabilities, prolonging the war and elevating Iran's role in the anti-Israel axis. The conflict reinforces Israel's view of Iran as its most serious strategic threat. By 2007, sanctions begin to bite. Iranian banks are cut off from SWIFT. Foreign investors flee. Access to USD and EUR-denominated credit becomes difficult. Oil revenues remain high, But importing critical goods, like aviation parts, cancer medication, and specialized machinery, becomes a logistical challenge. Dual exchange rates emerge. Black markets flourish. The government blames economic terrorism, while critics point to mismanagement. These sanctions isolate Iran, but also create new dynamics. Western firms withdraw, and state-linked conglomerates fill the void. The IRGC's engineering arm, Khatam al-Anbiya, wins billions in government contracts. Parallel to this, Ahmadinejad launches the Justice Shares program, Saham-e-Adalat, promising equity ownership to low-income families. Yet many recipients never see dividends or are unaware of their rights, with implementation remaining opaque. Culturally, Ahmadinejad pushes what many call a second cultural revolution. Dozens of university professors are dismissed. Humanities curricula are revised to align with Islamic ideology. The Ministry of Science purges administrators seen as secular. Students protest, but face increasing suppression. Student unions are infiltrated or dismantled. Publications are banned or absorbed into regime-friendly outlets. At the grassroots level, resistance adapts. With press freedoms curtailed, dissidents turn to the internet. Blogging booms. Social media platforms and anonymous forums become crucial for expression. Digital surveillance grows in parallel. The state begins constructing a national intranet. Censorship, firewalls, and proxy circumvention become a cat-and-mouse game. Projects like Balataran and Guya News become hubs for alternative journalism. Women emerge as central figures in civil society. In 2006, the 1 Million Signatures campaign begins, aimed at changing discriminatory laws. Organizers face detention, but the movement spreads. Even in the absence of formal political gains, civic consciousness deepens. Women also become prominent in underground culture, music, visual arts, and documentary film, redefining Iran's cultural identity despite legal constraints. Iran's regional position also evolves. In Iraq, Iranian-trained militias gain ground. The U.S. intelligence community and military begin to see Iran not just as a threat, but as a rising regional power. The U.S. responds with deeper sanctions, targeting banks, shipping, and IRGC-linked enterprises. Iran also deepens ties with Venezuela, Syria, and China, crafting what it calls a resistance economy. In parallel, Israeli policymakers ramp up global warnings about Iran's nuclear program. In 2008, Israeli officials begin openly lobbying the United States and Europe for preemptive action. Israeli intelligence agencies, notably Mossad, are suspected of covert operations inside Iran, ranging from cyber attacks like Stuxnet, discovered in 2010 but attributed to earlier efforts, to the targeted assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists. Tehran, in response, tightens internal security and publicly accuses Israel of sabotage. Inside Iran, economic pressure mounts. The rial weakens. Imported medicines become scarce. Yet the IRGC and affiliated bonyads thrive under sanctions, consolidating control of trade and procurement. The dual economy, one state-controlled, one black market, becomes more entrenched. Smuggling becomes normalized. Ports are partially privatized under IRGC-affiliated firms. By 2008, Ahmadinejad remains defiant. In public speeches, he boasts of Iran's global resistance and denounces arrogant powers. His popularity in rural areas holds, buoyed by direct cash distributions and symbolic rhetoric. But in urban centers, criticism grows. Technocrats warn of fiscal instability. Conservatives in the Assembly of Experts express quiet concern about over-centralization. Intellectuals, students, and even some clerics begin asking a pressing question: can Iran change from within the system, or has the system itself foreclosed reform? Former reformist leaders like Mousavi, Karoubi, and Khatami begin discreetly meeting. They consider re-engaging in politics, this time with a broader base and new tactics. As the decade closes, Iranian society stands at a precipice. Disconnected political tracks, reformist, conservative, revolutionary, and underground, all coexist but diverge in vision. The country awaits the 2009 election, unaware that it will trigger a mass movement and reveal the tensions that have been building for a decade. The reformist perspective. Reformists view this era as a crushing trajectory of missed opportunities. They recall the flourishing of civic discourse and incremental legal reforms under Khatami, only to see these suffocated by unelected power centers. The 2009 Green Movement embodied both a moment of awakening and of heartbreak, a generation demanding peaceful change, met with batons and bullets. Yet they also cautioned that Iran's growing international isolation, especially due to provocative rhetoric and opaque nuclear posturing, gave hardliners cover to escalate repression. Reformists blame both internal authoritarianism and external pressures for the narrowing of political space. By 2013, many were disillusioned but not defeated, recognizing that the battle for reform was long, uncertain, and existentially tied to re-engaging the world diplomatically. The conservative Islamist perspective. Conservatives argue that these years justified their worldview. Reform, when unchecked, invited chaos and foreign subversion. They see the Green Movement as Western-fueled sedition, and Ahmadinejad's rise as a return to revolutionary clarity. His fiery stance on Israel and support for Hezbollah were celebrated as courageous defiance of imperialism. Yet internal doubts festered, especially as Ahmadinejad's erratic behavior and economic missteps alienated key clerics and MPs. For many in this camp, the lesson of 2000 to 2013 was not to abandon revolutionary ideals, but to reassert discipline within their own ranks and guard against populism, veering into instability. The Revolutionary Guards and Deep State view. For the IRGC and security elites, this period marked their ascendancy. The Iraq War, U.S. threats, Israeli saber-rattling, and cyber attacks like Stuxnet all confirmed a siege mentality. The Green Movement was seen not just as dissent, but as existential infiltration. Their consolidation of economic power under sanctions and their role in suppressing protests were viewed as patriotic obligations. The Israel confrontation served as a strategic justification for militarization and cyber warfare. By 2013, the IRGC had become a multi-billion-dollar economic force and political kingmaker. In their view, they rescued Iran from both foreign plots and internal naivete. The nationalist and secular perspective. Nationalists and secular intellectuals saw the entire 2000 to 2013 arc as proof of structural failure. Reform was too slow, revolution too dogmatic. Internationally, Iran's obsession with Israel and bombastic threats squandered sympathy and strengthened the hand of hawks abroad. While they supported the Green Movement, they remained skeptical of its religious trappings. To them, progress lay in decoupling Iranian identity from theocracy and regional adventurism, values they felt had only deepened isolation. Many turned to exile, digital dissent, or quietist academic work. The monarchist and exile view. Exiles and monarchists watched this decade with a mixture of validation and frustration. Ahmadinejad's anti-Israel diatribes, the public hangings, and the violent suppression of protest seemed to vindicate their long-standing critiques of the regime. Yet their inability to influence events inside Iran underscored the growing disconnect. They lobbied Western governments, supported satellite channels, and funded activism, but remained sidelined from grassroots organizing. The Israel-Iran tensions also limited their credibility, as some Western observers viewed them as foreign tools rather than organic voices for change. The MEK and revolutionary left perspective. For the MEK and similar opposition forces, the era reinforced their belief that the Islamic Republic was irredeemable. They highlighted the 2009 crackdown, the nuclear brinkmanship, and Iran's alliance with militant proxies as proof that reformist narratives were dangerously naive. Their propaganda seized on Ahmadinejad's most inflammatory statements, seeking to rally Western support for regime change. However, their own record, including ties to Saddam Hussein, meant their message gained more traction abroad than at home. The quietist clerical view. Many traditional clerics viewed the period with deep discomfort. Ahmadinejad's apocalyptic language, messianic hints, and Israel provocations were seen as theologically reckless. They worried about the marginalization of clerical authority as the IRGC grew in power. The Green Movement showed them the costs of ignoring public discontent. While unwilling to break with the system, many privately questioned the wisdom of aggressive foreign posturing and cultural purges. They advocated for spiritual renewal over political radicalism, though few dared say so publicly. The modern analyst's view. Hindsight reveals a decade of converging crises. The reformist dream was crushed, but not erased. Ahmadinejad's populism ignited passions, but left inflation and isolation. The Green Movement showed the regime's fear of its own people. Meanwhile, the shadow war with Israel, from Hezbollah to Stuxnet, exposed Iran's vulnerabilities and ambitions alike. This was the decade when Iran's foreign policy, domestic security, and economic survival all became inseparable. The consequences were stark: a centralized, militarized state, surviving but brittle. Society adapted, subverted, and endured, laying the foundation for the next cycle of confrontation and possibly transformation. Segment 6, JCPOA to Soleimani, Diplomacy, Pressure, and a Funeral Flame, 2013 to 2020. The year is 2013. In a nation fatigued by sanctions, isolation, and economic suffocation, a cautious wave of optimism sweeps across Iran. Hassan Rouhani, a cleric with deep roots in the Islamic Republic yet branded a centrist and pragmatist, wins the presidency with nearly 51% of the vote in the first round. His campaign slogan, "Prudence and Hope," strikes a chord with a population yearning for dignity, economic stability, and renewed engagement with the world. Unlike his predecessor Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, whose defiance amplified Iran's alienation, Rouhani promises a recalibration. "The centrifuges will spin," he declares, "but so will the lives of people." Almost immediately, secret negotiations begin in the Sultanate of Oman between Iranian and American diplomats, with the knowledge and blessing of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. These back-channel talks lay the groundwork for what would become the most ambitious act of diplomacy between Iran and the West since the 1979 revolution. Over the next 18 months, Iran and the P5+1 nations, the US, UK, France, Russia, China, and Germany, hammer out a complex agreement. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA. Signed in July 2015, the JCPOA requires Iran to dismantle much of its nuclear infrastructure, reducing its uranium stockpile by 98%, limiting enrichment to 3.67%, and cutting operational centrifuges by 2/3. In return, the West pledges to lift nuclear-related sanctions, unfreeze billions in Iranian assets, and reintegrate Iran into the global financial system. The response in Tehran is electric. Crowds pour into the streets. Students wave Iranian flags and chant for peace. For a brief moment, it feels like the country is stepping out of the long shadow of siege. Rouhani's foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, becomes a national celebrity. Iranian airlines prepare to modernize fleets with Boeing and Airbus contracts. European trade delegations descend on Tehran. The rial stabilizes. Hopes surge. But jubilation is not universal. In Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu calls the JCPOA a historic mistake that paves Iran's path to the bomb. In Saudi Arabia, officials warn of an emboldened Shia arc stretching from Tehran to Beirut. In Washington, a divided Congress voices deep skepticism. Inside Iran, hardliners view the deal with suspicion. The IRGC, conservative clerics, and judiciary elites see in Rouhani's diplomacy a dangerous precedent. Compromise with the West, a return to technocratic rule, and dilution of revolutionary identity. Even as implementation begins in January 2016, structural obstacles remain. The U.S. maintains other sanctions tied to human rights, terrorism, and ballistic missiles. Major international banks avoid Iranian transactions, fearing American penalties. SWIFT connectivity is restored, but financial flows are hesitant. The sanctions architecture, though partially lifted, remains largely intact in spirit and in practice. While oil exports recover, the floodgates of economic transformation do not open. Frustration builds among Iranians who expected quicker change. Rouhani's administration presses forward. GDP growth briefly returns. Inflation slows. Energy partnerships with Total and other firms materialize. Urban centers see a modest consumer boom. Tourism picks up. Yet beneath the surface, economic gains accrue unevenly. The IRGC's vast network of economic arms, notably Khatam al-Anbiya, secure lucrative infrastructure contracts. Pseudo-privatized conglomerates benefit more than ordinary citizens. Tehran's northern districts thrive, but working-class neighborhoods see little difference. For many, hope quietly gives way to cynicism. Meanwhile, a different Iranian icon rises. Qasem Soleimani, commander of the IRGC Quds force, becomes a symbol of Iranian strategic depth. While Rouhani courts the West, Soleimani fortifies Iran's east and west. In Syria, he coordinates operations to preserve Bashar al-Assad's regime. In Iraq, he manages Shia militias under the Popular Mobilization Forces. In Lebanon, he strengthens Hezbollah's arsenal. In Yemen, Iran supports the Houthi movement. For many inside Iran, especially among the devout and the nationalistic, Soleimani is not merely a general. He is the personification of Iran's resistance doctrine. By 2017, the Trump administration enters the White House with a fundamentally different posture. It views the JCPOA as a flawed deal that rewards bad behavior. Netanyahu and Saudi Arabia find a more receptive ally. In May 2018, Trump unilaterally withdraws from the agreement and announces a maximum pressure campaign. Sanctions return in full force, targeting banking, shipping, oil, and even humanitarian channels. The goal, though never clearly stated, appears to be regime collapse or capitulation. The fallout is swift and brutal. The Iranian rial nosedives. Oil exports, which had topped 2.5 million barrels per day, fall below 300,000. European firms exit en masse. Instex, a European mechanism for barter trade, proves symbolic and ineffective. Rouhani's domestic standing crumbles. Critics accuse him of trusting the untrustworthy. Khamenei's earlier ambivalence now appears prescient. Reformists are discredited. Technocrats are sidelined. A new siege mentality returns. And with it, public rage. In December 2017, the first wave of economic protests spreads across provincial towns. But unlike the Green Movement of 2009, these protests cut across class lines. They are not about election fraud, but about bread, rent, fuel, and dignity. In November 2019, following a sudden announcement of fuel price hikes, protests erupt in over 100 cities. The government responds with a force unseen in decades. The internet is shut down nationwide for days. Security forces use live ammunition. Leaked videos show unarmed protesters shot at close range. Amnesty International estimates over 300 dead. Reuters places the toll above 1,500. What began as a protest against fuel prices becomes a revolt against the system's foundations. Simultaneously, regional tensions escalate. The Abqaiq Quraysh drone attack in September 2019 temporarily disables half of Saudi Arabia's oil output. Though the Houthis claim responsibility, U.S. intelligence attributes the attack to Iran. In Iraq and Syria, Israeli airstrikes target Iranian positions. Mossad conducts bold operations, including the extraction of Iran's nuclear archive in 2018. Assassinations of Iranian scientists increase. The shadow war intensifies. Amid this volatile mix, a spark ignites global shock. On January 3, 2020, a U.S. drone strike in Baghdad kills Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, deputy head of Iraq's PMF. Iran declares 3 days of mourning. Millions join Soleimani's funeral procession in Tehran, Avaz, Mashhad, and Kerman. Chants of death to America echo, but so do expressions of national grief. Soleimani's killing, though cheered by some abroad, galvanizes Iranians across political lines. For a moment, internal rifts close. Iran retaliates with Operation Martyr Soleimani, launching ballistic missiles at 2 American bases in Iraq. Though there are no fatalities, the act marks a rare direct strike on U.S. assets. The world holds its breath. A wider war seems imminent. Then, a catastrophe. On January 8th, as tensions remain sky-high, Iran's Revolutionary Guards mistakenly shoot down Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752. 176 people are killed, including dozens of Iranian-Canadian students. Initial denials give way to admission. Public fury explodes. Vigils turn to protests. Chants shift from anti-American slogans to, "Our enemy is right here." The Iranian state, by early 2020, is besieged on all fronts. Economically devastated, diplomatically cornered, morally questioned, and epidemiologically unprepared. COVID-19 enters Iran through Qom, its theological heart, and spreads rapidly. Hospitals are overwhelmed. Doctors lack PPE. U.S. sanctions complicate humanitarian aid. Clerics dismiss closures. The pandemic reveals the vulnerabilities not just of Iran's health infrastructure, but of its governing logic. What began in 2013 as a daring attempt at normalization ends in 2020 as a symphony of disillusionment, defiance, and death. The JCPOA, Iran's best hope for reintegration, lies in ruins. Rouhani, once a symbol of pragmatism, becomes a symbol of powerlessness. Soleimani, a man of war, dies a martyr but leaves behind a region burning. The Islamic Republic survives, but brittle, scarred, and uncertain, and the Iranian people, weary yet unyielding, carry on, through silence, satire, exile, or protest, still searching for a future that reconciles dignity with sovereignty, memory with modernity. Reformist perspective. To Iran's reformists, the JCPOA represented their highest hope and their deepest betrayal. Rouhani's election had been a mandate for change, a shift away from isolation, and a return to rational statecraft. When the nuclear deal was signed, they celebrated not just the diplomacy, but what it symbolized, the possibility of rejoining the world. But the collapse of the deal, despite Iran's documented compliance, confirmed what many had feared, that engagement with the West was always vulnerable to foreign political shifts. Trump's withdrawal gutted the reformist argument. By 2020, many reformists found themselves cornered, mocked by hardliners, abandoned by the West, and distrusted by a public angry over fuel protests and the tragedy of Flight 752. Yet a core group still clung to the belief that only diplomacy and structural reform, however slow or fragile, could prevent national collapse. Conservative Islamist perspective. Conservatives viewed this period as full vindication. From the beginning, they had warned Rouhani and his allies that trusting the United States was a fundamental error. The JCPOA, to them, was a strategic mistake that compromised Iran's dignity and sovereignty in exchange for superficial economic relief. When Trump unilaterally withdrew from the deal, it confirmed their worldview that the Islamic Republic should never negotiate from a position of weakness. Soleimani's assassination became a defining moment, transforming him from a behind-the-scenes commander into a martyr for their cause. His death reignited nationalist sentiment and justified continued resistance to Western pressure. Yet even among conservatives, there were concerns. Rouhani's failure gave them political leverage, but the rising tide of public unrest signaled that even their narrative of resistance might soon wear thin. IRGC and Deep State View. The Revolutionary Guards and security elite saw this period through a lens of strategic necessity. They tolerated the JCPOA as a calculated pause, not as a shift in long-term doctrine. While Rouhani's team handled the diplomatic theater, the IRGC focused on expanding economic influence and solidifying regional power. The collapse of the deal gave them more room to maneuver. Soleimani, commander of the Quds force, became both an operational leader and a public symbol of Iranian strength beyond its borders. His death was perceived as a moment of sacrifice that galvanized the state. It allowed the IRGC to further embed itself into Iran's security and economic infrastructure. From their perspective, global respect was to be achieved not through negotiation, but through deterrence, endurance, and controlled escalation. Nationalist and secular perspective. To secular nationalists and liberal intellectuals, the JCPOA was a fragile bridge to sanity, burned by both the US and Iran's own entrenched power structures. They had supported Rouhani not out of enthusiasm, but as a necessary alternative to more extreme figures. But by 2020, the regime's brutality during protests and its attempt to cover up the downing of Flight 752 had shattered the illusion that the system could evolve from within. They viewed Soleimani as a capable strategist, but resisted the state's attempts to deify him. To them, Iran had become trapped in a cycle of ideological defiance and economic decay. Many saw no viable path forward inside the country. Some left, others turned to digital activism or quiet forms of intellectual resistance. Monarchist and exile view. Exile communities, particularly monarchists, interpreted the events of this era as final proof of the regime's illegitimacy. They saw Rouhani's moderate image as a mask, one that fooled Western governments, but failed to change core policies at home. The JCPOA, in their view, only prolonged the life of a system built on repression. When the United States pulled out of the deal, they felt vindicated. Soleimani's death split opinion. Some mourned a fellow Iranian, others saw it as the removal of a regime enforcer. Across the board, exiles used the events of 2019 and 2020, especially the government's response to protests and the airline tragedy, to call for regime change. However, their influence inside Iran remained limited. Many Iranians viewed them as disconnected or too aligned with foreign interests. MEK and revolutionary left perspective. For the MEK and other revolutionary opposition groups, these years reinforced a core belief that the Islamic Republic was beyond reform. The JCPOA was seen as a distraction, used to mislead both Iranians and the international community. The protests of 2017 and 2019, along with the mass arrests and violence that followed, were interpreted as signs of a regime terrified of its own people. Soleimani's death was not mourned in this camp. They portrayed it as a victory in a broader struggle against regional militarism. However, the MEK's own controversial past, including ties to Saddam Hussein and allegations of cult-like behavior, continued to undermine their ability to build a legitimate domestic base. Their message gained more attention abroad than within Iran itself. Quietist clerical view. Among traditional clerics, this era was one of spiritual and political discomfort. Many were uneasy with the IRGC's growing influence and the blurring of lines between religious doctrine and military ambition. Rouhani's focus on diplomacy sidelined clerical authority, while Soleimani's rise further militarized the ideological tone of the republic. His death was mourned, but also used as justification for further suppression of dissent, something that troubled scholars rooted in ethical jurisprudence. The regime's denial of responsibility for Flight 752, followed by the public backlash when the truth emerged, deepened their concerns. These clerics did not openly oppose the system, but they grew more inward. Many turned away from political engagement and focused on religious scholarship, charity work, or teaching, quietly hoping for a rebalancing of power away from force and back toward faith. Modern analysts' retrospective. From a retrospective viewpoint in 2025, analysts see this period as the definitive collapse of Iran's last major reformist experiment. Rouhani's administration began with diplomatic optimism and ended in domestic despair. The JCPOA was both a high point of multilateral negotiation and a symbol of its limits. Its unraveling exposed how vulnerable progress in Iran remained to the volatility of international politics. The death of Soleimani closed a strategic chapter and introduced a new phase of uncertainty. Iran entered 2020 battered by protests, sanctions, and a collapsing social contract. Trust in leadership had eroded. The public had become angrier, poorer, and more skeptical of all political narratives. While the Islamic Republic endured, it did so in a more brittle, militarized form. The question no longer centered on whether change was coming, but whether that change would be evolutionary or explosive. Segment 7. Proxy, Protest, and Peril. Iran's Unfolding Struggle, 2020 to 2025. The year is 2020. The assassination of Qasem Soleimani has rocked the nation. His funeral draws millions into the streets. Grief blurs into defiance. Iran retaliates with missile strikes on American bases in Iraq, launching Operation Martyr Soleimani. No U.S. lives are lost, but the line between shadow war and open confrontation has been crossed. Then, in a tragic twist, Iran's own air defense mistakenly downs Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752. All 176 passengers perish. The initial denials, the delayed confession. It ignites outrage not at foreign enemies, but at Iran's own leadership. Grief turns inward. The public's fury simmers beneath the surface, barely cooled by the global eruption of COVID-19. As the pandemic grips the nation, Iran is caught in a perfect storm, a crippled economy, mounting sanctions, deepening public mistrust. Hospitals strain. Sanctions restrict access to medical supplies. Yet even amid crisis, regional strategy endures. Iran expands its influence through the so-called axis of resistance. In Iraq, pro-Iranian militias maintain pressure, launching sporadic attacks on American forces. In Syria, Iran entrenches militarily, building drone bases and precision missile sites for Hezbollah, inviting Israeli airstrikes that number in the hundreds. A shadow war simmers, rarely declared but constantly active. In Yemen, Iran's support for the Houthis grows more visible. Drone and missile technology makes its way into the hands of the rebels. They launch bold attacks deep into Saudi and Emirati territory. In January 2022, a drone strike on Abu Dhabi kills 3 people. Iran denies direct control, but few believe it. Then, a geopolitical surprise. In March 2023, China brokers a diplomatic breakthrough. Iran and Saudi Arabia agree to restore relations. Years of proxy war momentarily pause. It's a rare moment of pragmatism, an acknowledgement that even rivals sometimes need breathing room. Meanwhile, the confrontation with Israel escalates. In November 2020, Iran's top nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, is assassinated near Tehran, reportedly by a high-tech remote weapon. Iran blames Israel. The tit-for-tat continues. Mysterious explosions rock Iran's nuclear facilities in 2021 and 2022. Israel faces cyber attacks and naval sabotage in return. A shadow war becomes harder to conceal. In May 2021 and again in 2023, conflict erupts in Gaza. Iran-backed groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad launch thousands of rockets into Israel. The October 7, 2023, surprise assault by Hamas marks a grim turning point. 1,200 Israelis killed, many civilians. Hostages are taken. Israel invades Gaza. The war is brutal, unrelenting. Iran praises the attack as a victory for resistance, but denies direct involvement. Intelligence suggests foreknowledge, but no clear command role. Still, Iran-aligned militias across the region fire missiles and drones in solidarity, escalating tensions on every front. By 2024, Israel and Iran are no longer just fighting by proxy. Reports emerge of missile and drone exchanges. Israeli strikes allegedly reach deep inside Iran. For the first time in decades, the fear of direct war between two regional giants feels real. And then, in September 2022, something breaks inside Iran. Mahsa Jina Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman, dies in custody after being arrested for an alleged hijab violation. Eyewitnesses say she was beaten. The state says heart failure. A leaked brain scan shows trauma. Her death ignites a movement. Women burn their headscarves. Schoolgirls flip off portraits of the supreme leader. The slogan spreads like wildfire. Woman, life, freedom. Protests erupt in over 100 cities, more widespread, more intersectional than any before. Ethnic minorities, students, merchants, even striking workers join in. The regime responds with repression. Riot police, live rounds, base IJ militias, surveillance cameras, mass arrests. Over 500 people are killed. At least 70 are minors. Protesters are blinded. Some are executed after forced confessions. The UN calls it possible crimes against humanity, yet even in silence the movement survives. Woman, life, freedom enters the national consciousness. A cry not just against the hijab, but against the very foundations of authoritarian rule. Internationally, Iran faces growing isolation, but also pivots eastward. In 2021, it signs a sweeping 25-year strategic agreement with China. Billions in promised infrastructure and energy deals. In 2022, Iran begins supplying Russia with armed drones for use in Ukraine. In return, Moscow offers military hardware and cyber expertise. The JCPOA remains in limbo. Attempts to revive it under the Biden administration collapse by 2022. Iran demands the IRGC be removed from terrorist lists. The U.S. refuses, talks stall. Iran's nuclear program marches forward. By 2023, uranium is enriched to 60%, a short technical leap from weapons grade. The world watches, nervously. Israel threatens preemptive strikes. Military drills simulate attacks on Iranian nuclear sites. Iran conducts its own exercises. The threat of war becomes routine, almost expected. And yet, for all the confrontation, Iran endures. The regime survives pandemic, protest, and pressure. But the cost is staggering. Economic ruin, political isolation, and a society more fractured than ever. The children of the revolution now question its very premise. The streets may be quiet for now, but the silence feels brittle. As the curtain falls on 2025, Iran stands at another crossroads. Its leaders proclaim strength. Its people yearn for change, and the world holds its breath for what comes next. Segment 7. From Protest to Proxy War, Iran's Reckoning, 2020 to 2025. The year is 2020. Iran stands on the edge of a storm. Qasem Soleimani is dead. The JCPOA lies in ruins. The economy is battered by sanctions. And a new virus, COVID-19, is sweeping through the country. Hospitals fill. Borders close. The state scrambles to contain not just the pandemic, but the political fallout of a decade unraveling. But beneath this public health crisis, Iran's strategic doctrine remains unchanged: consolidate power at home and project strength abroad. Regional reach. The axis of resistance endures. In Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, Iran doubles down. U.S. troop drawdowns in Iraq and Afghanistan create a power vacuum, and Tehran steps in. Despite Soleimani's absence, Iran-backed militias in Iraq escalate pressure, politically and militarily, on Baghdad to expel remaining American forces. Rocket attacks on U.S. bases persist throughout 2021. In Syria, Iranian forces entrench further, constructing drone factories and precision missile sites to arm Hezbollah. Israel responds with an unprecedented airstrike campaign, targeting convoys, weapons depots, and command posts tied to the IRGC. Hundreds of sorties are launched between 2020 and 2023. This shadow war becomes normalized, a quiet but deadly chess match across Syrian skies. In Yemen, Iran's backing of the Houthi movement sharpens. Armed with Iranian-supplied drones and missile know-how, the Houthis strike Saudi and Emirati infrastructure, including the dramatic 2022 drone attack on Abu Dhabi that kills 3 civilians. Iran denies direct control, but UN experts trace components back to Tehran. Then, in a dramatic turn, China brokers a diplomatic breakthrough in March 2023. Iran and Saudi Arabia agree to restore relations after years of proxy conflict. The détente cools tensions, especially in Yemen. For Iran, this is not just pragmatism, it is strategic survival. Covert war, Israel's shadow campaign against Iran. Meanwhile, a separate, more dangerous front escalates: Israel's campaign of covert warfare against Iran. In November 2020, Iran's top nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, is assassinated near Tehran, allegedly by a satellite-controlled machine gun, a sophisticated operation attributed to Mossad. It is not the first time Israel has targeted Iran's nuclear program, but it is perhaps the boldest. Throughout 2021 and 2022, explosions, cyber attacks, and sabotage strike Iranian nuclear facilities. The Natanz enrichment site is damaged twice. Iranian officials vow retaliation, but their responses are restrained. In turn, Iran is accused of cyber attacks on Israeli water systems and shipping vessels. A shadow war at sea erupts. Tankers and freighters linked to both nations come under attack in the Red Sea and Gulf of Oman. By 2024, this shadow war crosses a new threshold. Israel launches drone strikes inside Iranian territory, including a reported attack on a military factory in Isfahan. Iranian officials confirm the strikes, but downplay their impact. The rules of engagement have shifted. For the first time in decades, Israel and Iran exchange direct fire, marking the erosion of long-held deterrence. The October 7th war and genocide allegations. In October 2023, Hamas stages a stunning cross-border attack into Israel, killing over 1,200 people and taking hundreds hostage. The scale and brutality shock the world. Israel responds with a full-scale ground invasion of Gaza. What follows is one of the deadliest assaults in modern Middle Eastern history. Thousands of Palestinian civilians are killed. Entire neighborhoods are flattened. Humanitarian corridors are bombed. Medical infrastructure collapses. UN agencies declare a state of emergency. International observers, including former Israeli officials and UN rapporteurs, begin to describe the campaign as ethnic cleansing, even genocide. Iran, though not directly involved in planning the attack, praises Hamas's actions as a legitimate act of resistance. Tehran frames the war as a turning point in regional history. Supreme Leader Khamenei hails it as a divine victory, while Iranian media glorifies the resistance axis, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. But Iran's involvement is not just rhetorical. During the war, Iranian-backed groups across the region, particularly in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, launch coordinated drone and missile attacks on U.S. bases and Israeli targets. Hezbollah increases its activity along the Lebanese border. Iran's proxies signal readiness for escalation, though Tehran itself avoids direct war. Despite U.S. and Israeli claims, intelligence assessments stop short of confirming that Iran orchestrated the October 7th attack. However, there is consensus that Iran had long armed and trained Hamas and was likely aware of the group's growing capabilities. Domestic crisis. Woman, life, freedom. While Iranian missiles fire abroad, another fire burns at home. In September 2022, 22-year-old Mahsa Amini dies in the custody of Iran's morality police. Her crime, allegedly wearing her hijab improperly. Eyewitnesses report she was beaten in custody. State authorities claim she died of heart failure. A leaked medical scan suggests trauma to the skull. The public erupts. Women lead the charge. Schoolgirls remove their headscarves. Mothers cut their hair in public. The chant spreads like wildfire. Woman, life, freedom. For the first time since the 1979 revolution, protesters target not just policy, but the system itself. Death to the dictator echoes in Tehran, Tabriz, Zahedan, and Isfahan. The uprising is unprecedented in scope, crossing class, ethnic, and gender lines. The regime responds with brute force. Over 500 are killed, dozens executed after sham trials, thousands imprisoned, including minors. International bodies, Amnesty International, the UN, label the crackdown a likely crime against humanity. In places like Zahedan and Sanandaj, entire communities are subjected to lethal repression. And yet, the protests leave a mark. Even as the streets fall silent, surveillance increases, and arrests rise, the slogan survives. Woman, life, freedom enters the national lexicon, etched in the minds of a generation. Global realignment and the nuclear threshold. Geopolitically, Iran moves east. In 2021, Tehran signs a sweeping 25-year cooperation agreement with China. The deal promises infrastructure investment, military collaboration, and economic lifelines, though much of it remains opaque. In 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. Iran supplies Moscow with Shahed drones used to bombard Ukrainian cities. In return, Russia reportedly provides military technology and intelligence. The alliance deepens, prompting new rounds of sanctions from the EU and UK. The West's response hardens. Negotiations to revive the JCPOA falter by mid-2022. Iran demands the IRGC be removed from the U.S. terror blacklist. The Biden administration refuses. Talks collapse. By 2023, Iran begins enriching uranium to 60%, a technical step from weapons grade. Experts warn that the breakout time for a nuclear weapon could be weeks, not months. Iran insists its program remains peaceful. Israel does not believe them. By mid-2025, credible reports emerge that Israel has conducted 2 direct missile and drone attacks inside Iranian territory targeting nuclear infrastructure. Iran confirms foreign aggression, but avoids escalation. Still, both sides now openly prepare for war. Israeli military drills simulate strikes on Natanz and Fordo. Iran boosts air defenses and mobilizes its proxies, a region on the brink. As of June 2025, the Middle East stands more volatile than ever. A war in Gaza has transformed into an international crisis. The shadow war between Tehran and Tel Aviv is no longer covert. Domestic unrest simmers beneath surveillance and fear, and a generation raised on protest, surveillance, and repression now watches the horizon. Not for reform, but for survival. The Islamic Republic has weathered the storms of war, assassination, and revolt, but it enters the second half of the 2020s at a crossroads, emboldened abroad, embattled at home, and more isolated than ever. The centrifuges spin, the missiles fly, and in the silence between sirens, an entire nation holds its breath.